Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Matthew Friedman, and I have been a staff attorney with the Utility Reform Network for the past 15 years. Based on my experiences, I want to highlight a few key concerns with the current ex parte rules and practices, identify possible solutions, and discuss the need for statutory reforms to the standards for disqualification of commissioners who make private deals with utilities. This is the issue that the chairman mentioned at the beginning of the hearing. First, the current ex parte rules are riddled with loopholes that can be easily manipulated by experienced parties. I want to highlight a few examples to provide context for our overall recommendations. First, utilities routinely have discussions with commissioners and their advisors about procedural issues to avoid triggering the ex parte rules. Professor Weissman discussed this in his testimony. A discussion about procedure can easily stray into matters of substance. Second, communications with the General Counsel, with the Executive Director, and the directors of all the various divisions are not covered under the ex parte rules. So utilities frequently meet with these individuals to express their concerns about issues pending in current cases. These staff, in turn, are free to speak with any commissioner about any issue at any time, and they can privately pass along concerns that are raised by the utilities. Third, utilities often provide commissioners and their advisors with general briefings that they claim are unrelated to issues that are being litigated in pending cases and therefore would not be subject to the ex parte rules. But these general briefings often echo and reinforce specific factual, legal, and policy positions that the utility is pushing the commission to adopt in contested proceedings. Fourth, representatives from credit rating agencies and investment firms regularly meet with commissioners to discuss ongoing general rate cases or penalty proceedings. These individuals are concerned about the potential impact of PUC decisions on utility profits, spending, exposure to risk, and credit quality. Yet they have no ex parte reporting obligation. Fifth, the ex parte disclosure requirements state the party must provide various details about the timing and the location of the communication, what individuals were involved, and a description of what was discussed. The description of the communication itself is perhaps the most critical element of the reporting, but utilities routinely provide very generic statements about the content of their conversation and omit many meaningful details. Sixth, parties in rate-setting proceedings must provide notice of private communications with commissioners within 3 working days to allow other parties to seek equal time. Utilities have gamed this rule by meeting with commissioners less than 3 days before a vote on a pending matter and releasing the ex parte notice after the vote has occurred. This practice, which is fully permissible, denies other parties an opportunity to even seek their equal time before the issue's been decided. Seventh, and this has been discussed in the last panel, the sanctions for noncompliance with the ex parte rules are not sufficient to deter repeat offenders, and they're not applied with any consistency. The statutory penalty is set between $500,000 and $50,000 for each offense. This amounts to little more than a wrist slap for a major utility seeking regulatory approvals that may amount to billions of dollars. Instead of financial sanctions, the Commission has also devised alternative methods for remedies, such as in a 2006 case, where violations by PG&E led to a requirement that the utility develop written best practices to guide its own ex parte contacts. The PUC General Counsel found that the final document submitted to comply with this requirement demonstrated that PG&E had made a, quote, good faith effort to develop best practices in the area. Ironically, the document was developed by the same PG&E vice president who was recently fired for rampant violations of the ex parte rules and is currently a possible target of a criminal investigation into improper influence peddling. In light of these realities, we urge the legislature to enact sensible reforms that would limit loopholes and abuses. And our recommendations include the following: banning individual ex parte meetings in rate-setting cases. This was the subject of the last panel. So long as individual parties can meet privately with commissioners and advisors at will in cases where large amounts of ratepayer money are at stake, utilities will dominate that process. Utilities have massive staff resources devoted to lobbying the Commission, and they're financed through the rates that are charged to their customers. If individual meetings are permissible, the utilities will continually deploy their well-funded staff to make legal and policy arguments through private meetings with anyone at the PUC who will listen to them. Second, more reliance on all-party meetings and all-party written communications. In rate-setting cases, ex parte contact should be limited to meetings where all active parties are invited to participate. Any written materials provided to a commissioner or advisor should also be circulated to other parties at the same time. Third, broadening the definition of decision maker to include top commission staff. This is the subject of a bill that the chair has, a bill that Senator Hill has, and a bill from Senator Leno that would expand the definition of the decision makers that are covered under the ex parte rules. Fifth, make individuals working for credit rating agencies or anyone advising utility investors also subject to the ex parte rules. Anyone with a financial interest in the outcome of a commission proceeding should be subject to these rules. Since the utilities often cite the expectations of Wall Street in their requests for higher profits, individuals representing credit rating agencies and advising utility investors should be treated just like representatives of consumers for purposes of the ex parte rules. And finally, increasing the sanctions for violation of the ex parte rules. As recent media reports demonstrate, the current sanctions are ineffective at preventing repeat offenses by utilities. The sanctions should provide effective deterrence by imposing meaningful financial penalties, revoking ex parte privileges for repeat offenders, and perhaps even establishing criminal liability. Now, I'd like to turn to the issue that was mentioned by the chair in his opening statement and that we'd like to talk about, which has to do with standards for disqualification of commissioners due to bias and prejudice, and this directly links to the ex parte communications. Recent press accounts suggest that commissioners have engaged in wheeling and dealing with utilities behind closed doors. This behavior is not new, and astonishingly, may not even be prohibited under the Commission's own rules. Even when a commissioner privately directs a utility to undertake a particular action, there is little recourse for parties seeking to litigate the outcome in a contested proceeding. A motion seeking to disqualify the commissioner assigned to a particular case for impermissible bias or prejudice is typically ruled upon by the commissioner accused of bias. Sounds absurd, but this is established commission practice. Even worse, the legal standard for disqualification in a rate-setting proceeding is whether there is clear and convincing evidence that the commissioner has an unalterably closed mind on matters critical to the disposition of the proceeding. Although this issue has been litigated in a number of proceedings, I want to discuss a specific case we were involved in involving San Diego Gas and Electric Company, one of its affiliates, and the Calpine Corporation. In May of 2003, SDG&E conducted a solicitation and sought bids to satisfy an identified need for 291 megawatts of new resources in its local area by 2007. In the litigation that followed this solicitation, TURN and the Utility Consumer Action Network, or UCAN, uncovered significant evidence demonstrating that PUC President Michael Peavy had personally intervened to ensure that SDG&E selected Calpine's Otay Mesa power plant as the winning bidder. The evidence demonstrated that Commissioner Peavy engaged in a series of ex parte meetings with both Calpine and SDG&E executives. Commissioner Peavy also sent commission staff to directly participate in negotiations over the plant. TURN obtained notes from these negotiations describing commission representatives explicitly telling SDG&E that Commissioner Peavy wanted SDG&E to own or contract with Otay Mesa. And despite originally expressing an interest in a single power plant to satisfy its 291 megawatts of need, SDG&E ultimately proposed two such plants as part of over 1,200 megawatts of new resources, including a $739 million contract for Calpine's Otay Mesa plant and the acquisition of Sempra Generation's Palomar plant. The Commission ultimately approved SDG&E's proposals on a closely contested 3-2 vote, with Commissioner Peavy providing the deciding vote. TURN and UCAN filed two motions seeking to have Commissioner Peavy disqualified from voting on this matter. Consistent with standard practice at the Commission, Commissioner Peavy himself considered and then denied our motions. In his denial, he stated that although he had indeed facilitated negotiations between Calpine and SDG&E, there was insufficient evidence to demonstrate that he had an unalterably closed mind on the proposal. He refused to apologize for his active role and insisted instead that he would have done a disservice to the community had he failed to become involved. The Commission ultimately concluded that even if all the allegations of involvement were true, Commissioner Peavy could not have been shown to have an unalterably closed mind because he may have been open to different combinations of terms and conditions governing the deal. Today, we are publicly releasing new evidence highlighting the extent to which Commissioner Peavy directly intervened in that case. This evidence comes in the form of an eyewitness account from an individual who worked as a lawyer for Sempra Generation during this period. In her account, she describes being called into a meeting with representatives of SDG&E, Sempra Generation, Calpine, Commissioner Peavy, and the individual who was subsequently assigned to be the administrative law judge reviewing the reasonableness of the Otay Mesa contract. In this meeting, Commissioner Peavy explicitly told SDG&E to make a deal with Calpine for Otay Mesa and promised that all approvals related to the plant, including SDG&E's separate request for over $200 million in new transmission, would be granted. According to the eyewitness account, Peavy also told SDG&E that failure to complete a deal for Otay Mesa would lead to a rejection of SDG&E's efforts to acquire the Sempra's plant. There's little doubt that this direct intervention forced SDG&E to sign a contract it didn't need or want, and there was no ex parte notice that was filed. Yet, even if news of this meeting had become public, it's not clear Commissioner Peavy would have been disqualified, because it's almost impossible to demonstrate that decision makers have an unalterably closed mind. Indeed, no commissioner has ever been disqualified based on the unalterably closed mind standard. And the PUC has repeatedly decided that this standard is a matter of law. This means that only a change in the law will cause the PUC to modify its own practices. And the legislature can make this change in two ways. One, we're proposing that under no circumstances a judge or commissioner accused of bias or prejudice should be permitted to rule on that very motion. It makes no sense to have the decision maker decide whether they themselves are biased. Second, the appropriate legal standard should be modified to ensure that if a commissioner was directly involved in shaping a utility request or directing a specific contract to be executed, they shouldn't be allowed to vote on the proposal. These are modest reforms, but they represent a step in the right direction. The legislature has to recognize that the PUC is very unlikely to reform itself. Real reform is going to require changes to state law. And there are several reform bills. Two of the authors are here today that are coming before this committee, and hopefully these bills will allow legislators and stakeholders to find meaningful agreement on the desirable elements for change. We have brought today the former Sempra attorney who was an eyewitness to the transaction and the discussion that I mentioned, and we will be releasing a statement from her to the public and the press today, and she's here available for public comment at the end of the panels, and would be happy to answer questions if members of the committee have them.
Ms. Chen, did you want to make some comments?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for having us here today. Greenlighting is a research and advocacy organization, or as we like to call ourselves, a think and do tank, focused on closing the racial wealth gap and improving economic opportunities in California's communities of color. Though communities of color constitute 60% of California's population, there are very few racial equity advocates appearing before the commission. So I want to give you a bit of a perspective from that of a smaller, slightly outside-the-box organization that does appear before the PUC. Greenlighting relies on the Commission's public process to ensure that our voices and the interests of our communities are heard by those making decisions that affect our bills every month and our service every day. We also rely on the Commission's rules and processes to ensure that our interests are fairly considered and given proper weight as the Commission deliberates. Like many advocates, we always knew we were outnumbered at the PUC. You walk into an all-party meeting, a workshop, something like that, I show up with 1 or 2 people because that's all I've got to bring. The utilities show up with closer to 10 folks. So we just sort of know that we're outnumbered, and we kind of took it as par for the course. Like many, I think we were astonished to learn just how much the process was being steered behind closed doors by conversations held entirely in private. Where we had previously believed that our interests were best served by maximizing our own access to decision makers, we now realize that when you only have 1 or 2 staff, or even if you're a bigger organization that has maybe 10 or 20 staff, we still cannot compete with the regulated entities. We're simply outnumbered. No matter how just or how many consumers or how many interests we represent, we cannot compete with the barrage of influence that's being exercised by more well-resourced parties. I've had the occasion to hear industry stakeholders say in public things like, it's only an ex parte if someone's watching. This attitude and it was followed by chuckles, but not in the right way. This attitude clearly indicates an environment where an advocate is put at a disadvantage by following the rules. It also clearly indicates that those rule followers may enjoy nominal access, but there's a whole other realm of access that's simply out of our reach. This is a climate in which some are afforded that unfair advantage that Professor Bayless spoke of, and usually over the interests of consumers, the environment, workers, and so on. I would also note that in a matter that's currently pending before the Commission, in documents that are filed in public, there is a party that is awaiting a merger approval at the Commission. I guess it's Comcast, I can say that because who else is waiting for a merger? Comcast has stated in both an all-party meeting and in its filings on the proposed decision in that merger that it intends to negotiate conditions for the merger with the Commission through the ex parte process. So to state publicly and to put in your filings that you intend to work out what effectively is major public policy through the ex parte process indicates a real problem. As an opponent of the merger and as a party to that proceeding, we're highly concerned by the idea that such a negotiation could take place and would be entirely permissible, and that we would be effectively shut out of that conversation. You've asked me to tell you a little bit about what works and what doesn't with the Commission's ex parte practices. Public access works. Private access, and a system that heavily skews toward one type of party, does not work. Private conversations about pending issues unlevel the playing field and take decision-making out of the context of the merits and into the arena of horse trading. But public, transparent, equal access, that works. And we need room for the real public, as Mr. McGuire mentioned, not just intervener representatives, to be heard as well. Mr. Chairman, you asked ALJ Gamson whether lobbying is per se a bad practice at the PUC, and I want to comment on that from Greenlining's perspective. As an advocate for communities whose needs often go unrepresented, we still need the opportunity to be heard by decision makers and their advisors. That face-to-face contact is critically important for advocacy, for deliberation, for collaboration, as I think you know since you invited us here today. I'm going to say that this is even more important for those who bring a bit of an outside-the-box perspective. We've heard the PUC mentioned as an economic regulator, and that's most certainly true. Greenlining brings a racial equity perspective to utility rate making, where there's often talk of cost effectiveness, cost of capital, very technical matters. So our perspective is a little bit outside the box at first, but the opportunity to make our case in person and explain face to face why our perspective matters is critically important for those of us who bring a somewhat unconventional point of view, but one that is relevant and one that matters. So as you think about this issue, I would urge you to think in terms of equal access and unequal access, and in terms of leveling the playing field. How can we make access equal, and how can we make it transparent? The previous panelists have mentioned the use of all-party meetings, and we've found that to be pretty effective. There are variations in the way that individual staff and individual offices will conduct those meetings, but by and large, those all-party meetings allow everybody the same access to decision makers in full view of everyone and without any closed doors. What I say to a decision maker in an all-party meeting, I say to everyone. The Commission will also sometimes hold workshops in proceedings, which are similar all-party events. Usually the commissioners are not present. Sometimes they do attend. These workshops give parties a similar opportunity to share information with each other and with the Commission and staff, and discuss options in a more collegial, less adversarial setting. One of the things that we have always appreciated about ex parte conversations is the ability to answer questions. I love it when a commissioner or an advisor asks me a question about the perspective that I'm bringing, because then I know that they're thinking it over, and I have an opportunity to maybe show them something that they haven't thought about yet. I personally believe that this ability to have a dialogue with stakeholders benefits decision making. However, There is nothing that is uniquely beneficial about having that conversation in private instead of in public. And in fact, I think we've seen there's a great number of potential detriments to having those conversations in private. As long as there are still workshops, there are all-party meetings, and that there are other public forums where stakeholders and commission staff can share information and exchange ideas, we will still benefit from openness, but we will not see the kind of abuses that we've seen in these infamous emails and the ensuing aftermath. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Wetch?
Mr. Chairman and members, Scott Wetch on behalf of the California State Association of Electrical Workers. We have been a very active, perhaps one of the most active interveners at the CPUC for decades. And while we definitely agree with the gist of this hearing and that there's reforms that could be implemented to make the ex parte process more transparent, we agree with many of the recommendations. I'd like to say from the get-go, I disagree that there's not value to having ex parte communications. I disagree with my good friend Matt Friedman about including rate-setting hearings in the ban on ex parte communications. I view it very similar to campaign finance law. We should shine a light on it. We should maintain maximum disclosure, but there is a value to having, there's several reasons why there's value to having those sorts of opportunities, to have more time, to have questions, to dig in to issues that perhaps a very lengthy hearing does not provide. But specifically, I think it helps protect against the tyranny of the bureaucracy, because as elected legislators, you've all dealt with state agencies where the management that's not accountable, the middle management, the upper management, who are not accountable to anybody, have vast amount of control of the information that goes to the decision makers at the top. And they're constantly having conversations, and if you don't think that staff, careerists at agencies like the PUC don't develop certain biases, certain prejudices, or certain cozy relationships, and then they have unlimited access to influence those decision makers, you're just wrong. It does exist, and that is a check on that tyranny of the bureaucracy. What I would suggest is that you make those more transparent. In all the ex parte meetings that I've had over the years, I have noticed that when there is staff, commission staff, not necessarily personal advisor, but commission staff present in those meetings, which they are many times, are asked to attend, that the attention to the reporting on the ex parte and the detail that is required is much greater. So you may want to consider requiring that when ex parte communications take place, that there is somebody present in those meetings, a solicitor general or somebody independent that is a compliance officer, perhaps. Perhaps you require a stenographer. I've never had an ex parte where my client and I were afraid of having everybody in the world know to the word what we said. So that could be an option, but I don't think you should just throw the baby out with the bathwater, because I do believe there's some value. I think the way to do it is with disclosure and with penalties, stiff penalties. The penalties that Mr. Howard suggested, going after the practitioners. Do you know how many vice presidents there are at some of these utilities? One year there's more new vice presidents hired than there were new apprentices brought into the trade at that particular utility. And so if you go up and you disqualify Vice President Smith, tomorrow it will be Vice President Jones that will be there. So the penalties have to be stiff, but I think the penalties should apply both. There has to be penalties on the commissioner as well, right? If there is a consequence to the commissioner, then I think you would have a great deal more compliance. I think the biggest loophole that this entire hearing has completely missed is the fact, as Mr. Howard said, is that, well, we still aren't talking about, anything leading up to an actual proceeding. Well, if you have a general rate case every 3 years, and you know the date in which that proceeding starts, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to know that you go in and have your meetings prior to the actual proceeding. And in fact, I think the case study on this, the most infamous case of that, has to do with the meeting that we now know about that Southern California Edison had in Warsaw at the Bristol Hotel with Commissioner Peavy. Because at that meeting at the end of March in 2013, when an active investigation was happening, they had a very lengthy discussion regarding what a settlement would look like. So what's the significance of that? Well, the significance of that is that a motion to settle would then dissolve the need for the investigation to continue at the PUC, right? But because they weren't discussing the investigation, they were discussing the settlement, therefore they weren't discussing an active proceeding, because the settlement proceeding hadn't begun yet. In fact, even though 2 years later, Southern California Edison disclosed that meeting after the subpoena was released, they have refused to release the emails about that meeting. And in fact, that is their defense. Their defense, I'll quote their lawyer, Henry Weissman, communications about issues that might conceivably arise in future phases, and then in quotation, of the investigation of San Onofre, were therefore not at the time reportable as an ex parte communication. So Edison's defense in releasing the emails about that meeting with Mike Peavy in Poland is that, hey, we were discussing a settlement, but it was 3 months later that they opened the settlement proceeding. So none of that we have to disclose. So what's the significance of that? If the chief regulator outlines for you what a potential settlement he has in his mind might look like, doesn't that undermine the complete creation of the record that was discussed earlier from your first panelist, which all decisions have to be based on a record? But that makes a mockery of the whole process, because if you know where the regulator wants to go at the end, you fashion the record to justify what you know is what he wants to impose. I'll remind you, ratepayers took a $3.3 billion hit on that settlement, and shareholders of the company took $1.4 billion hit on that. There's all kinds of ramifications about that information. I own stock in Edison. You know, I pay attention to every quarterly stock report. I certainly would have liked to have that information when I was deciding to buy or sell stock. Unfortunately, only a few had that. I wasn't one of them. But I have to imagine, knowing how Wall Street might respond, thinking, boy, this settlement could be 5, 6, 7 billion. That could really hurt Edison's bottom line. But you know that the guy who's going to have the most influence over the decision has already told you what he thinks he wants to look like. So the significance of this leading up to a proceeding can be huge, as we just saw. So it should really apply to communications with commissioners at all times and disclose it. Because if not, then they just, you play the date game and you just make sure that you go in just right before. So with that, we applaud the committee for looking into this. We think you should take many of the items raised today and dig further. And thank you for allowing us to testify.
Thank you, Senator Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One question, and first, Mr. Wetch, thank you. I thought that was great testimony, and I think your point at the end is well taken, and we should look at that seriously. Mr. Friedman, you raised the issue, and it goes kind of closely to Mr. Wetch's comment about when that proceeding starts. You mentioned rate-making cases, when it should start, but what about advice letters? And we follow, if you look at advice letters and the manner in which they're used, how they change, they become everything almost at certain points in time if you follow the history of them. How should that apply? Should the ex parte apply from the beginning, or do you think it should be at all?
Well, ex parte advice letter filings occur within particular proceedings, and there are 3 categories of advice letter filings. Some are very ministerial and really are not subject to dispute, and some actually raise significant policy concerns. I don't think the advice letter process is very good at dealing with disputes on matters of policy. The staff are typically the ones that are attempting to simply implement a decision at the commission, and when we have raised concerns saying we think there's a policy problem here, we have very little luck getting those concerns taken seriously, because I think it's the view of the commission that any significant dispute of that type should be resolved in a proceeding, not in a compliance filing, which is how they think about advice letters. Now, there are no ex parte rules that apply to advice letter filings. So you can go in and talk with any commissioner you want all day and all night without reporting it. And in fact, many large procurement contracts are submitted for approval through advice letter filings. These can be contracts, 20-year contracts worth hundreds of millions or even billions of dollars. So I think that it would make sense to take a closer look at the advice letter process to see whether there's the need for ex parte restrictions and reporting requirements, particularly around the high dollar items. Maybe not for all of them, since some of them are really so technical that they're not the kind of issues that people end up fighting about.
Thank you. Thank you very much for being here. Thanks for your testimony. It's very helpful. You had some great suggestions that we do expect to follow on. I think that the ex parte issue goes beyond just simply the simple transparency matter that I think is so important in preserving the public's trust in their government and their state. I think this can eventually translate into better decisions and decisions that ultimately lead to better pricing for consumers. That's my wish, and if our work here today could result in that in the future, I think everyone as a whole will benefit, especially California's economy. We are going to wrap up our hearing now. Our last item is the public comment process. We thought we'd open it up to some of you out there that didn't have the opportunity to be on the panel, but we want to hear from you. If you could form a line. We have a microphone. If you want to say a few comments, you have about a minute to weigh in. We'd like to hear from you. Please state your name and where you're from and begin your comments.
Hello, good morning. My name is Sandra Bauer, and I represent Citizens Oversight, a public member group located in San Diego County. Citizens Oversight was founded in 2006 to promote increased civic engagement by the public. For the past 2 years, it has represented ratepayer interests before the PUC, most specifically investigation into the San Onofre nuclear power shutdown and decommissioning. So I would like to second the testimony that Mr. Welch gave on this particular issue. We commend your committee for looking into the cozy relationship between the PUC and utilities represented by the many improper ex parte communications that have been recently revealed. These communications represent not just a violation of some arcane and arbitrary rule of practice and procedure. They are symptoms of a much more severe disease. The meeting between PUC ex-President Peavy and Southern California Edison General Counsel Stephen Pickett in Washington, Poland, likely defined the complete settlement deal on San Onofre, long before any evidentiary record was created. The phases of the investigation were designed to avoid any actual investigation into the safety implications of the decision to both approve the steam generator project, but also the decisions made by SCE executives that resulted in the demise of the plant. This was followed by proceedings all put on for show, followed by secret negotiations with Tern, who was misled into thinking they were actively negotiating, but were only being manipulated into accepting the preconceived Peavy and Pickett settlement.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for your comments. Thanks for being here today.
Mr. Chairman, Senators, I am the person that Mr. Friedman referred to. My name is Kelly Foley. I have almost 20 years of experience as an energy industry professional, primarily as an attorney. I worked for both PG&E and Sempra Energy. I was also privileged to be an advisor to a California Energy Commissioner. I worked for an environmental nonprofit, and most recently, I'm general counsel of a CCA provider. And I wanted to just give you background as to why I shared this information with Tern, because it is 12 years after the fact. And I think, it's water under the bridge at this point. But I'm not passing judgment on any of the participants and not on the PUC. Instead, I think it's important to relay to the legislature that, while it was problematic, this recounting of what happened 12 years ago is problematic. What's more problematic is that it was business as usual. And similar to what Mr. Weissman said, I think it's unfortunately almost so normal that when the emails came out, the recent emails came out, it wasn't surprising. What was surprising was that the emails came out, but the content wasn't surprising at all. And a lot of unfortunate things have happened in California related to energy. And energy it's a vital part of California, not just the economy, but our everyday life, people's well-being. And the duty of the Public Utilities Commission to ensure safe, environmentally responsible, affordable, reliable power is without question. And I was listening to the various panelists, and I think they all floated very good ideas on what needs to be reformed, but I think the key thing is something has to be done.
If you can begin to wrap up, please.
The loopholes need to be closed.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, did you want to make some closing comments? We're adjourned. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for being here today and for all the speakers.